Biden's transition team had an interesting message for Dems that were doubting GOP cooperation with the incoming administration. Eye rollers are wrong to doubt Biden's ability to legislate effectively with Republicans.
Just watch us, they say. Democratic strategist and council member at large in Montgomery County, Maryland, Will Jawando, and also senior policy analyst with the Independent Women's Forum, Inez Stepman, are back with us. Inez, let me start with you on this one. So these were the initial comments. There was first item actually that came out was Biden saying that like 7 GOP senators had reached out to him and been like, we promise, just give us like 6 months and then we're totally going to work with you. Well, what happens in that first 6 months? That's when like all the momentum of your presidency comes and goes. So they're like, just wait past the time when you could actually get something done and then we're totally going to work with you. Then the next item is in reaction to that, people like myself and many, many others were like, that's ridiculous and rolled their eyes. So then they get the like, just watch us thing. But then the third piece that I love is meanwhile, Biden's campaign manager, who's now like deputy White House chief of staff, I think Jen O'Malley Dillon, she gave this long profile interview to Glamour magazine in which she said that Republicans are a bunch of effers and Mitch McConnell is terrible. Can't disagree with most of that, in my opinion. However, the team that's supposed to be all about bipartisan cooperation was apparently not too happy with her comments here. What do you make of all of this, Inez?
Well, leaving Mitch McConnell and establishment Republicans aside for a moment, I mean, this sounds very much to your typical conservative or even your typical sort of right of center person as what we've been hearing for years and years, right? Which is on the one hand, you're a bunch of, racist, bigoted, xenophobic, terrible human beings and effers. On the other hand, unity. So oftentimes those calls for unity have sounded a lot like, for conservatives, like, oh, just agree with us on all the issues that are really important to you, especially those culture war issues. Just acquiesce to what we want, and then we'll work with you. And that's how I interpret this. I think that's how a lot of conservatives interpret this. It may have more to do with inside baseball between like McConnell and Democrats behind the scenes as to what like everything you just alluded to. But the average person, I think, right of center or even in the center, hears this as we're going to call you a bunch of names because your beliefs are different than ours.
Yeah, well, what do you make of this, Will? Probably not the best outreach strategy if you're actually seeking some bipartisan cooperation. Or is it that bipartisan cooperation is just like this fetishized thing which isn't actually going to happen?
Well, probably both and, unfortunately. I think, look, I know Joe Biden, he means it. He comes from a place where he wants to have bipartisan cooperation. I think of like, walk softly, carry a big stick. Jen O'Malley Dillon is among the top reasons that now President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris are in the White House. And carries a big stick. And I think she calls it how it is. And she's a fierce protector of her boss. And were they the most artful words? Probably not. But I don't think this changes Joe Biden's outlook on how he wants to approach it. Naive as it may be from, especially with Senator McConnell, who on day one, I was there in the Obama White House at this time when he said, my number one job is to make sure that he doesn't get reelected. And he blocked everything and made sure that he tried to make sure that happened. So
we failed.
I think it's just, that's what it is. And I think it's much to do about nothing, really.
I mean, Will, here's the thing that's interesting, too. Some of the conjecture I saw is that there's kind of a divide, right? Because you've got some younger members of the team, people like Jen O'Malley Dillon, who really came of age in politics during the Obama era. And so they have a more modern interpretation of GOP intent here, which I share, which is if you think that they're going to want to come hand in hand with you and come to the table and negotiate in good faith, where have you been living for the past decades in Washington? You're crazy. Versus an older guard like Joe Biden and the aides that have been around him for decades who came of age during a different time when, look, we have a lot of contempt for a lot of the bipartisan deals that actually were struck, which often were for things like wars and deregulation and ending welfare. But there's this sense of we all share the same goals, we have motives, and it'll be ugly on the outside, but behind the scenes, we're gonna have dinner together and have a drink and get something done. So there's this kind of mishmash of understanding of how Washington even works that is embodied in these types of disconnected comments coming out of the team.
I think that's totally right. And I would say it's even, I worked in the Senate in 2006 through 2010, and we had bipartisan negotiations on major legislation. Like Mike Enzi's staffer was one of my best friends, and we talked on the Education Health Committee, right? That stopped. That immediately stopped after 2009. Being a staffer on the Hill now is none of that happens. And so I think it's a fairly recent thing. And you're right. People who have experienced that are like, there's no way they're going to work with us. And their deeds haven't shown that. And so I think you're right. I think is that divide. But look, that's always happens in parties. I remember when I was telling people, my mentors, that Barack Obama was going to be president, and they were like, "What are you talking about, young guy? Go away. It's Hillary Clinton all day." So I think we are changing. Things have evolved, and we're going to see where it goes. But I think that's a generational divide for sure.
Yeah, and Inez, here's my biggest fear, is actually that they are going to work together in order to pass terrible things, like new TPP or new NAFTA or some terrible, like bipartisan, more troops in Iraq or more troops in Afghanistan. Those are the types of things which get more bipartisan cooperation every day here in D.C., and that they're going to work together on. And that is actually where I fear. The real question to me is there going to be any sort of movement in, I wouldn't even say a populist direction, but in a different direction from where we saw in the original years? What do you think?
So 2 parts there. One,
yeah.
I agree with you about a lot of bipartisanship. I think it's exactly that consensus that is so unpopular with both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, one of the most bipartisan things to happen, for example, under Bush was No Child Left Behind. All right, that's extremely unpopular among conservatives. It was unpopular among conservatives at the time. It's unpopular among Democrats. It's unpopular among anybody. And we're talking about, on the one hand, we fetishize bipartisan consensus, and on the other hand, we say drain the swamp. Well, those two things are the same. And then in terms of the ideological direction of the Biden administration, I think the opposite is going to happen. I think with the movement of very clear movement of big business into the Democratic column this time, I think that's going to change any kind of, they're going to put a stop to some of the more economic populist stuff that the Democratic Party might have otherwise supported. And what they're going to feed their base instead is going to be the woke stuff. So I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with this, but I'm calling this woke neoliberalism. Yes. So I think the Democratic Party is going to moderate itself on economic issues, particularly with either way with a closed Senate. But it's going to go full bore on, I think, the Biden administration. You're going to see a lot of woke EOs, right? You're going to see a lot of dear colleague letters on things like trans accommodation in public schools, on school discipline. Obviously, I'm an ed, so all my examples come from education. But reinstating critical race theory trainings. Like, I think that's where he's going to try to satisfy those to his left. While listening more to what is essentially the new corporate side, more aggressive corporate side of the Democratic Party, now that they've completely rejected the right on cultural issues.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you.
Guys, great to see both of you. Happy holidays. Always appreciate you all.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Gary. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. All right, coming up on Rising, the subways in New York are betting on federal aid to avoid deep service cuts and layoffs. The international president of the Transport Workers Union, he discusses the situation in New York and public transportation crisis at large. That's when Rising continues.